Once he was a proud and holy man of the church, lauded and applauded wherever he went. But this was before his fall, his failure. He had fought on the front lines for 3 decades or more, forever buoying up the faith of all who surrounded him. His sermons were a thing of power and purpose, and filled all around him with righteous zeal. But that was before his encounter with chaos. On that day, he saw the skies turn to fire, the land roil and quiver. The very air he breathed was acrid and thick. And on that day, when the Lord of Change erupted into reality, when its birthing screech pierced the heavens and made his mind collapse, on that day, he succumbed to the most human of all emotions, the most simple of drives, fear and survival. He turned tail and fled, desolate and confused, terrified. But he was found later, his ignominy known, his reputation forever shattered. He wept uncontrollably. He shuddered like a doe in the teeth of a wolf. He was temporarily broken. That was then, and this was now. Now he stood in a huge room made from black marble, from its floor to its highest rafters. Darkly foreboding, he felt so small as he looked up at her. A canoness of the Holy Order of our Martyred Lady, his friend, his doom. He was brought forward harshly by the 2 Sororitas at his sides, as if he would run now. Where could he go, even if he wished to? The canoness looked down as he stopped, and without pause for the moment, she proceeded, the bile dripping off every word she intoned.
The accusations have been read. The evidence has been heard. Your deceit and cowardice attested without a shadow of a doubt. You are guilty. Have you any last words before I pass judgment?
He knew it would avail him naught, and contrary to his will, his mouth opened, and he began. Long have I served the Emperor, all my life. I have faced those things few others could. I have striven mightily in the name of the Emperor. You of all people know this, my past, my deeds. I had one moment of weakness, one instant of doubt. Does the one act wash away all that I have done in his name? Does it count for naught? I am but a man.
A man? Alas, no longer. For you are now less than nothing. You are a traitor, and your defense is the greatest of shames, the most overwhelming of evidence, the most cardinal of sins. You convict yourself further by its utterance. Some who come before me, I am almost tempted to indulge in that greatest of all weaknesses, clemency. But not for thee, for we were both at the Schola Progenium. We rose together, and thus do you admit that you were once a shepherd of humanity, a lord of the Emperor's light, a prince of the Church. So you who knew of the Emperor's light, knew of his virtue, sung his name in psalm and holy song, you turned your back on his light. You who knew him best, loved him least, you betrayed him. Thus you are the basest of things, most wretched of all. For you knew and still turned from him. I am ashamed to know you. I am ashamed that you still draw the same breath as me. I am ashamed that you still live. Thus do I pass judgment.
The words seemed to echo back at him, and he saw the sneer on her face that they elicited. Never before had he seen her face take on such a countenance when addressing him. It stung as much as her words, the hate and loathing in her eyes. With each word his head lowered, his shoulders sagged further. He was broken.
You will be taken from this place and interred in an engine of penance, so you can still serve as an example. An example of what happens to the abhorrent, to those who indulge in the sin of weakness. You will end your days in pain and suffering, and the knowledge that you will never be accepted into the light of the Emperor upon your final death. For even the God Emperor of mankind will take no pity on your soul.
He was then led away, as she nonchalantly just waved her hand, as if dismissing something beneath her contempt. Continued after the law. Welcome, gentle listener. I'm Baldermort, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and war gear of the Warhammer 40k universe, the grim darkness of the far future. And today, we come across one of the elements of the game that can be rather controversial: the Gothic horror. Despite always having a deeply comedic element to the hobby, lore, and game, this has now been matched by what many call the grim dark element, the horror implicit in nearly all factions. Well, except perhaps, just perhaps, the Orcs, Tau, and Eldar, but certainly not Drukhari or Dark Eldar, I hasten to add. For today we are to discuss the engine of penitence, of the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. And there are few objects of war gear that epitomize the grimdark more than these horrors. But for the basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote, Engines of Penance. Beneath many cathedrals and sanctuaries, there exist vast dungeons lined with the Ecclesiarchy's myriad torture devices. These dread machines are reserved for those who have sinned against the Emperor, and through arcane technologies, they transform the agony of their victims into a devastating weapon. Penitent engines. To be a pilot of a penitent engine is to have committed a terrible crime, one so heinous that other punishments are deemed too lenient. Many of the unfortunates sentenced to a pilot a penitent engine were once members of the Ecclesiarchy, priests fallen from grace, or sisters who have caused the death of their fellows. One so judged is wired into the crucible of a penitent engine, where torment amplifiers are spliced to their synapses, and chemical injectors are implanted into their spines. From that point on, the hapless individual is subjected to endless suffering, their mind stripped of all thought except physical pain and spiritual guilt, the pain itself driving the penitent engine's actuators and servos. Penitent engines charge towards the foe heedless of danger, knowing that only in death, theirs or the enemy's, can absolution be earned. The arms of the engine, mounted with enormous framers, blaze a trail of fiery destruction as it thunders forwards. Upon reaching the enemy, the chemical and synaptic inputs pumped into the pilots are altered, causing them to see their own face in the faces of their foes, flashing before those before it, each a reflection of their unfathomable guilt. They rampage through the enemy's battle lines, leaving death and carnage in their wake. Some engines bear adamantine-toothed buzz blades that are capable of cleaving through plated tank armor, while others mangle flesh and pulverize bone with lashing swings of their multi-headed flails. Penitent engines are often deployed beside the ranks of the Order's militant. The Sisters of Battle consider it their sacred duty to witness these great machines in the fires of combat, observing the actions of their fallen brothers and sisters as their tone for past sins. Every enemy slain by a penitent engine's brutal stampede proves the righteousness of this form of punishment. Mortifiers. Aside from the unthinkable act of outright heresy, there is no greater sin amongst the Adeptus Sororitas than when a repentia flees from battle. The sole duty of these sisters is to atone for their failings in battle, and to run from this fate is an evil which there can be no forgiveness. As punishment, these wayward repentia are wired into the crucible of a mortifier. Based upon the same mechanical chassis as a Penance engine, a mortifier bears additional neuro-agonizer arrays and oblique wheel enhancers that amplify the pilot's self-loathing exponentially. Metallic bolts driven into the Repentia's bones leave her unable to move or even scream for death, while the baffle hood placed over her head prevents her from hearing any words of piety that are spoken in her presence. Mortifiers are then placed on the front lines of battle, where they are driven into a frenzy by the intense spiritual suffering of their pilots. The engines lurch forwards with terrifying speed, leg pistons firing and contracting in time with the rapid jolts of anguish that shoot through the interred sisters. As they bound forwards, they spray hails of bolts and torrents of flames from their arm-mounted weapons before launching themselves at their enemy and carving a path of mutilation. All joy that would come from seeing heretics torn to shreds is denied to the Repentia, stripped from their minds and replaced with more pain. Their only hope of release from the torment, from this cruel existence outside of the Emperor's light, is to find oblivion in death. And yet, when a mortifier has sustained an obscene amount of damage, and the sister within senses that her end is at last approaching, the pain of knowing she will die unredeemed sends the machine into a tortured death throe, a wild and final whirlwind of destruction. To those Repentia who not only fled but betrayed their sisters in battle, an even worse fate awaits. After being wired into the crucible of their mortifier, they are further entombed behind thick adamantine casing. This sarcophagus protects their tortured bodies from incoming fire and desperately swung blades, denying them the release of death. Known as anchorites, the sisters behind these lifeless masks are forced to face their torment in absolute isolation, enduring years or even decades of agony before meeting their end. End quote. As we have heard, the engines of Penance, both mortifiers and penitent engines, are truly fates worse than death. These are not the honoured interments into a Space Marine dreadnought. They are a punishment and a curse as bad as any I can think of in the setting. Although there are always worse out there, of course. It depends on how deeply you wish to delve into this particular wing of the hobby and lore. The horror. And no other word can be used to describe the fate of those doomed to dwell in these walking tombs, these lurching sarcophagi of unrelenting, never-ending torture. For there is no shred of mercy or clemency, or what we would call compassion or humanity in many, if not most, of the wings of the regime we know of as the Imperium. One might ask, why do people bother to even try to exist in this world? Is there no place for pity or mercy or hope? Well, the answer to that is simple. If you are a player of an Imperial faction, it is up to you to try to build it. You fight for it. By making space for victory, by holding back the tide of Xenos and evil-twisted, warp-corrupted traitors and cults, you permit humanity to dream of these things. For if the Imperium could ever go from being under siege, fighting for its very existence every second of every day, on a number of theatres of war that are almost as numerous as the stars themselves, if you could gain victory enough to go from holding on and holding out to making progress, then here is where these things could flourish. It is the nature of the unrelenting war that permits the structures of the Imperium to exist, to go unchallenged. If threats were removed, if Xenos defeated to the last and the least, if chaos were somehow pushed back and then somehow eradicated, then, and only then, could the horror of the Imperium begin to slacken, to be alleviated, and a road to the bright future of the dream of the Imperium be returned. So if you wish to indulge this fantasy of a utopia rising from the ashes of the degenerate, corrupt and bloated carcass of the Imperium, then know this. With every battle you fight, with each victory you gain, with each foe defeated, you may just be building the space for that transformation to happen. But honestly, I would not dream this dream too hard or for too long, for in the grim darkness of the future, there is only war. And if that ever ends, well, we then have sumptuous collections of toys, instead of gallant and terrible warriors and armies. And I, for one, hope this never happens. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to the engines of penance of the Adeptus Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing. If you do, then also hit the notifications bell button, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, back to the action. The Canoness stepped down the many stairs from her elevated position of authority. Upon reaching the black marble floor, she was immediately flanked by her 2 ceremonial guards, despite her being more able than any other to defend herself. She sighed deeply as the events of the day were sorted, compartmentalized, and then ostensibly forgotten. She would need her head to be clear for the days and weeks ahead. The transports had arrived, and her order were now readied for embarkation. As she approached the door to her inner sanctum, she turned and nodded to her guards. Only one was necessary at her door. The other could make the final call go out.
Tell the sisterhood, all of the order of the martyred lady that reside here, tell them to make haste to the spaceport as previously instructed.
The guard nodded, but then turned, the words not quite sinking in until that point. She looked at the Canoness for confirmation.
Yes, all. Even the garrison. Now go.
As the sister marched down the halls to carry out her orders, there seemed to be a spring in her step, a buzzing in her more hurried stride. It had been many centuries since the entire force had been fielded. Everyone knew that this order, this level of response, could only mean a battle of legendary importance and scope. The Canoness walked inside her sanctum and allowed the door to close before she exhaled long and hard and leaned against the door and whispered to herself.
For where we go, we will need every last sister, every last sinew, every last ounce of faith. For we go to Abundance Tertius. Lord Emperor, have mercy on our souls.
I hope you'll all extend your gratitude and thanks to our guest voice actress, Gremlin Girl. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.